I said, our text for today is a very familiar one. 1 Corinthians 13. The passage that I've read probably at 90% of the weddings that I've done. So we kind of know it as the wedding passage. But even though we read it at weddings frequently, Paul wasn't actually talking about romance or marriage in this passage. He actually wrote this letter to a church in crisis. You see, all of his work to bring people together was on the verge of collapsing. The congregation in Corinth started out really well. Paul and his associates gathered a very diverse group of people. The town of Corinth itself was very cosmopolitan. There were people of many different races from many different countries there. It was kind of a trade center. So as is still the case today, the church is generally a reflection of the people in the community. So this was a very diverse church. And it all started out, it was going pretty well. Paul and his associates gathered this diverse group of people together, and they dedicated themselves to peace and justice as Jesus had taught. And they formed a community that was based on the common good. But when Paul left, things started to go off the track a little bit. Community members began to go back to their old patterns. They began honoring the rich over the poor, the religiously gifted over those that were otherly gifted, educated over the illiterate, men over women, adults over children. And we know this because, as with all the other Pauline letters, we don't have the letter that came from the church in Corinth, but what we have is Paul's response to that letter. So that's what we're looking at today, is what Paul is writing back to this church to help them to find their way again. So in response to the letter from the church, Paul tells them to return to love. In this passage, which I believe is finally the core of Paul's letter to the church in the Corinthians, Paul uses the word agape, as I told the kids, 9 times to emphasize its importance to the community and to the communal life. Agape, of course, means love in Greek. But not just any love, it means the unconditional love of God. So for Paul, love was an expression of commitment to a life in community, one that valued the gifts of every single person. So biology didn't matter as much in family for Paul as did a theology of community, church, and communion. So it's with this historical background and understanding in mind that I invite you to once again hear the words of the apostle. If I speak in tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. But when I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now we know only in part, then we will know fully, even as we have been fully known. And now, faith, hope, and love abide. These 3. But the greatest of these is love. May an understanding of this text take root within our being, and may it blossom forth in actions of kindness and grace and love. Howard Thurman was a renowned scholar and theologian. But he grew up during a time and in a place, the early 1900s in Daytona, Florida, where educational opportunities for black citizens were rare. As a matter of fact, there were only 3 high schools for black students in the entire state. And the closest church-related high school was in Jacksonville, 90 miles away. And Thurman, being an exceptional student and person of faith, wished to attend that school. So his community got together and they pooled their resources and they came up with enough money for him to further his education. At the train station, however, Thurman learned that he would have to pay extra to ship his rope-tied trunk that he had with him. So as a result, he didn't have enough money to get on the train. So there he was, this young man, with all the high hopes in the world of going off to high school to get an education, stuck at the train station, sitting on the steps out front, weeping. It was then that a stranger, another black man, asked him why he was crying. After Thurman explained his situation, the man paid for the rest of his fare. But before Thurman could thank him, the man walked away, and he never saw him again. Now, the stranger saw a young man in despair, and in his generosity, he made a difference. He didn't ask for anything in return. He just saw a need and responded. The man may or may not have thought of his gift as an act of love, but it changed the trajectory of Howard Thurman's life. And this is what One Great Hour of Sharing does for people all across the planet. It interconnects us. It restores broken dreams. It resurrects hope. And it carves a path into the future. Now, all throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, I've heard a consistent refrain. And that refrain is this: we'll all get through this together. We'll all get through this together. And that's finally what love, agape love, looks like in real time. It looks like people willing to share their resources to make the way easier for others, offering hope and kindness and care. Agape, you remember agape, the thing that Paul referred to all those times? Well, agape, as I said before, is God's unconditional love, but it goes even deeper than that. Agape is a love that's rooted in concrete acts of compassion. Think about helping people rebuild after hurricanes and tornadoes, teaching farming method as the climate continues to change, providing chickens to ward off poverty, and yes, even paying the fare for someone who's desperate. Through all kinds of weather, even in the unknown, it's important for us to understand that through God, through emulating the agape of God, love remains. And as Paul espoused, and as Howard Thurman understood, and as Jesus himself taught, love is lived out in diverse community, reaching out beyond oneself and one's own self-interest. And that kind of love, my friends, is finally what can transform the world. You know, I read a couple of things this week that I wanted to share with you this morning as we talk about agape and about One Great Hour of Sharing. And the first one comes from a blog that I like to read. It's called Journey with Jesus. And speaking about the nature of love and Paul's perspective, the author writes these words: "It's not simply that love must outweigh the obvious bad things in our lives, things like greed and envy and lust and hatred. Love must even outweigh the good things, even faith itself, that much touted gift that the writer of Hebrews describes as the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Faith is nothing without love." But do we actually believe this? Not in theory, but in practice. Do we value love more than being right, or growing wise, or wielding power, or amassing wealth, or acquiring knowledge? In the context of the church, do we really give love primacy over right doctrine or beautiful imagery? And she goes on to say, before we say yes too quickly, we'd do well to notice that Paul's love chapter says little about feelings. The love he describes is robust and dynamic. Think verbs instead of adjectives. Love is not an emotion. It's not something we wait around for or fall into. It is muscle, movement, sweat, action. My friends, love acts patiently and kindly. Love acts against the impulses of envy, irritation, and arrogance. Love yields, love rejoices, love endures, and yes, love remains. In other words, love doesn't stand around and wait for warm fuzzies. It gets up and gets moving. And in that spirit, I'd like to close with the second thing that I wanted to share with you today. It's a poem. And the poem is called Love Remains by Karen Georgia A. Thompson. Destruction visits again. Tornadoes sweeping through the night skies, people displaced. Their cries cutting the crisp morning air. The explosion of volcanoes thought long asleep moves the earth. Lava creating new roads, ashes falling like snow from the skies in tropical places. We see our longing. Love remains. Tears visit coursing cheeks stained by dirt and marred by grief. In the din haunting of piles of debris and devastation, children stare, stunned by the displacement of the known. The silence heaping hands emerge. We touch our hope. Love remains. Chaos sweeps with spring on floods and rising waters from melting winter snow. Overwhelmed lakes overstepping their sensible banks. Swollen rivers creating new courses, taking with them homes and lands and crops. We watch, aggrieved as again lives are disrupted. We hear our courage. Love remains. Our loved ones are dead. Our siblings, homeless, with no words enough to express the losses of war. We weep in disbelief of what we see unfolding among us. We stand wounded and broken. In the acrimony coursing through the air after the fires, we hold on tightly to each other with love unfurling around us. We feel our strength. Love remains. Love defying words cannot find hope, or cannot find holds our fears and our tears, tending to our despair, dispensing hope. We stretch our arms across the miles we stand together, giving from what we have, sharing with those in need. We give thanks sharing God's love. We extend beyond ourselves one more time, because this one great hour unfolding infinitely, we live out generously. We smell the sweetness of our unity, and love remains. When all comes down around us, love remains. As we continue on this journey we call Lent, may love remain in our words and in our actions and in our hearts. May it be so. Amen.
Amen.